So you're a medieval queen. Congratulations, you live in a palace, wear a crown, and have servants attending to your every need. Sounds great, right? Wrong, because your entire value as a human being depends on one thing: whether or not you can produce a male heir. Your body isn't yours anymore. It's a political tool, a dynasty-building machine, a weapon, and the smartest queens. They knew it. They didn't just accept this reality, they weaponized it. They used pregnancy to negotiate treaties, delayed consummating marriages to gain leverage, hid miscarriages to protect their political influence, and turned their children into bargaining chips before those kids could even walk. Childbirth wasn't just a biological function, it was warfare, and the battlefield was the royal womb. Welcome to the brutal, bloody, brilliant politics of medieval motherhood. Let's begin. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, a queen had one primary job: produce a legitimate male heir. That's it. Not governing, not advising, not diplomacy. Those were bonuses. Your essential function was biological. You were expected to get pregnant, stay pregnant, give birth, survive, and do it all over again until you produced a son. Preferably multiple sons, in case the first one died, which happened a lot. If you failed at this, your position was in jeopardy. Your husband could annul the marriage, citing your barrenness as proof that God disapproved. He could take a mistress and legitimize her children instead. He could remarry, and you'd be shipped off to a convent, stripped of your title, erased from history. This wasn't theoretical. It happened constantly. But here's the twist. Precisely because childbirth was so critical, it gave queens enormous power. If you were pregnant, you were untouchable. You couldn't be divorced while carrying a potential heir. You couldn't be easily sidelined or ignored. Your body, specifically, what was inside it, became the most valuable asset in the kingdom. And smart queens exploited this ruthlessly. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval history. She was married twice, first to Louis VII of France, then to Henry II of England. With Louis, she had 2 daughters but no sons. That marriage was annulled in 1152, officially due to consanguinity, which means they were distant cousins, but really because Eleanor hadn't produced a male heir. Louis thought he was done with her. He wasn't. Eleanor immediately married Henry II, who would become King of England. And then she did something remarkable. She had 8 children with Henry, including 5 sons. She proved that the problem wasn't her fertility, it was Louis. And in doing so, she humiliated her first husband and secured her place as one of the most influential queens in European history. But Eleanor didn't just have children, she used them. She raised her sons to challenge their father. She encouraged rebellion. She turned her children into political instruments. And when Henry tried to imprison her for it, he couldn't fully erase her influence, because she was the mother of his heirs. Her body had given her leverage that even imprisonment couldn't destroy. Or consider Isabella of France, wife of Edward II of England. Edward was more interested in his male favorites than in his wife, which was humiliating for Isabella and politically dangerous for England. But Isabella was smart. She had 4 children with Edward, including the future Edward III. And once she'd secured the succession, she stopped pretending to be the obedient wife. In 1326, she invaded England with her lover, deposed her husband, and ruled as regent for her son. Her ability to produce heirs gave her the legitimacy she needed to overthrow a king. Without those children, she would have been nobody. With them, she became one of the most powerful women in Europe. This was the paradox of queenship. Your body was controlled, restricted, scrutinized, but it was also your greatest weapon. The womb was a cage, but it was also a throne. Here's something most people don't realize. Medieval marriages weren't always consummated immediately. Sometimes the bride was too young. Sometimes political circumstances required delay. And sometimes the queen herself delayed consummation, because as long as she remained a virgin, she had options. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled more easily than a consummated one. So if you were a queen in a dangerous political situation, married to a weak king or to a king you suspected might be overthrown, keeping the marriage unconsummated gave you an escape route. You could argue for annulment. You could negotiate a better match. You could buy time. Margaret of Anjou, wife of the mentally unstable Henry VI of England, understood this game perfectly. Margaret was married to Henry in 1445, but their marriage wasn't consummated for years. Some historians believe it took up to 8 years. Why? because Henry was mentally unfit. He suffered from catatonic episodes. He couldn't govern, let alone father children. Margaret needed to secure her own position first, and that meant building alliances, consolidating power, and waiting for the right moment. When she finally did get pregnant in 1453 and gave birth to a son, Edward of Westminster, she used that child as proof of her legitimacy and as a weapon in the Wars of the Roses. Her pregnancy gave her the political capital to act as regent, lead armies, and fight for her son's inheritance. Without that pregnancy, she would have been sidelined. With it, she became a warrior queen. Pregnancy could also be announced strategically, even if it wasn't certain. Queens sometimes claimed to be pregnant to halt political proceedings against them, to prevent annulment, or to secure treaties. A pregnant queen couldn't be easily removed. Her condition demanded respect, care, and protection. And even if the pregnancy turned out to be false or ended in miscarriage, the delay alone could be enough to shift the political landscape in her favor. Then there's the issue of proving pregnancy. In medieval courts, a queen's pregnancy had to be publicly verified. Midwives, physicians, and court officials would examine her. This wasn't about medical care, it was about political assurance. Everyone needed to know the heir was legitimate, that the queen wasn't faking, and that the child would be born under proper supervision. This public scrutiny was humiliating, invasive, and dehumanizing. But it also gave queens a strange kind of power. If they controlled the narrative around their pregnancy, they controlled the court. Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, is a perfect example. Anne knew that her entire position depended on giving Henry a son. When she became pregnant in 1533, it was announced with great fanfare. Astrologers predicted a boy. Celebrations were planned. And then she gave birth to a girl, Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I. So Henry was furious. Anne's failure to produce a son weakened her position immediately. She had 2 more pregnancies. One ended in miscarriage, the other possibly in stillbirth. And in 1536, Henry had her executed on trumped-up charges of adultery and treason. But here's the thing. For 3 years, Anne's pregnancies kept her alive. Every time she announced she was pregnant, Henry couldn't move against her. Pregnancy was her shield. When that shield failed, she was destroyed. This is the dark side of using pregnancy as leverage. It works until it doesn't. And when it fails, the consequences are catastrophic. Let's talk about something medieval. Sources rarely discussed openly, but that happened constantly. Miscarriages. In an age without modern medicine, miscarriages were common. Some estimates suggest that up to 30 to 40% of pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. But for queens, a miscarriage wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political disaster. If you miscarried, it raised questions. Was God displeased? Was the marriage cursed? Were you defective? Your enemies would use it against you. Your husband might start looking for a replacement. Your position at court would weaken. So what did queens do? They hid miscarriages. They announced pregnancies and then quietly disappeared from public view, citing illness or religious retreat. If they lost the baby, they'd delay the announcement, claim the due date had been miscalculated, or, in some cases, simply never speak of it again. Catherine of Aragon, first wife of Henry VIII, had a heartbreaking reproductive history. She was pregnant at least 6 times. Most ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Only one child survived infancy, Mary, the future Mary I, but Catherine tried desperately to hide her failures. When she miscarried a son in 1510, Henry was devastated, but Catherine immediately tried to get pregnant again. When she miscarried again in 1514, she withdrew from public life. She knew that every lost pregnancy brought Henry closer to divorcing her, and she was right. By the late 1520s, Henry was convinced that Catherine's inability to produce a male heir was divine punishment. He sought an annulment, married Anne Boleyn, and Catherine was cast aside. Her miscarriages, hidden, whispered about, used against her, destroyed her marriage and her legacy. Then there's the case of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife. Jane succeeded where Anne and Catherine had failed. She gave Henry a son, Edward VI, in 1537. But the birth was difficult. Jane became ill almost immediately, likely from puerperal fever, a common and deadly infection. She died 12 days after giving birth. But here's the important part. Jane's death was useful to Henry. She'd given him a son and died before she could fail him. She was memorialized as the true queen, the one who fulfilled her duty. Her body had served its purpose, and then it was done. Queens also had to navigate the politics of phantom pregnancies, times when they believed they were pregnant, announced it publicly, and then nothing happened. This could be due to medical conditions, stress, or psychological factors. But in a royal court, a phantom pregnancy was humiliating and dangerous. Mary I of England, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, experienced this twice. In 1554, and again in 1557, she announced she was pregnant. Court physicians confirmed it. Preparations were made for the birth, but no baby came. Some historians believe she had ovarian cysts or tumors that caused her abdomen to swell. Others think it was psychological, her desperate desire for a child manifesting physically. Either way, the failed pregnancies destroyed her credibility. Her enemies mocked her. Her husband, Philip II of Spain, lost interest, and when she died in 1558 without an heir, her Catholic restoration died with her. Her womb, or rather its failure, had determined the fate of an entire nation. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and phantom pregnancies weren't just medical events, they were political earthquakes. And queens who couldn't control the narrative around their reproductive failures often lost everything. Once you successfully gave birth, your problems didn't end, they evolved. Because now you had a child, and that child was a political asset, not just to you, but to everyone else. Your child could be used to secure alliances, legitimize claims to the throne, or be held hostage to control you. Medieval queens understood this, and the smartest ones used their children strategically, sometimes ruthlessly. Let's start with Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I of England. Matilda was designated her father's heir, but when he died in 1135, her cousin Stephen seized the throne instead. What followed was a brutal civil war known as the Anarchy. Matilda had a son, the future Henry II, and she used him as both a symbol of her legitimacy and as a bargaining chip. She couldn't win the throne for herself. England wasn't ready for a queen regnant, but she could secure it for her son, and she did. By positioning Henry as the rightful heir and negotiating with Stephen's supporters, she ensured that when Stephen died in 1154, Henry became king. Matilda had lost her own battle, but she'd won the war for her child. Then there's Blanche of Castile, Queen of France and mother of Louis IX, St. Louis. Blanche was a regent for her son when he inherited the throne as a child, and she was ruthless. She crushed rebellions, negotiated treaties, and ensured that Louis's position was secure. But she also controlled him. Even after Louis came of age, Blanche continued to wield enormous influence. She used her role as the king's mother to maintain power far longer than most queens could. Her son wasn't just her legacy, he was her weapon. Children could also be used as hostages in the literal sense. Royal children were often sent to foreign courts as part of marriage negotiations or peace treaties. If their parents broke the agreement, the child's life was forfeit. Isabella of Valois, daughter of the French king, was married to Richard II of England when she was just 6 years old. She was essentially a hostage, a living guarantee of peace between England and France. When Richard was deposed and murdered in 1399, Isabella's position became precarious. She was eventually returned to France, but the experience illustrates how royal children, especially daughters, were expendable pawns in political games. And let's not forget the darker side, infanticide, and suspicious deaths. If a queen's child threatened someone else's claim to the throne, that child could accidentally die. The princes in the Tower, Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, are the most famous example. After their father, Edward IV, died in 1483, the boys were placed in the Tower of London by their uncle, Richard III. They disappeared. Most historians believe they were murdered, likely on Richard's orders, to secure his own claim to the throne. Their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was powerless to stop it. Her sons had been taken from her and used as political obstacles, and then eliminated. Queens lived with this terror constantly. Your child was your greatest asset, but they were also your greatest vulnerability. And if you couldn't protect them, they'd be used against you. Here's the grim reality. Childbirth in the medieval period was one of the leading causes of death for women. Infection, hemorrhage, obstructed labor. Any of these could kill you. And if you were a queen, dying in childbirth was almost expected. It was seen as noble, even saintly. You'd literally given your life to produce an heir. But here's the twisted part. If you died giving birth to a son, Your death was celebrated. You'd fulfilled your duty. Your legacy was secure. But if you died giving birth to a daughter, or if the baby died too, your death was seen as tragic, but also pointless. Jane Seymour, as mentioned earlier, died 12 days after giving birth to Edward VI. Henry VIII mourned her, not because he loved her more than his other wives, but because she'd succeeded where the others had failed. She gave him a son, and then she conveniently died before she could disappoint him. She was buried with full honors. She's the only one of Henry's 6 wives buried beside him. Why? Because her womb had done its job. Compare that to Catherine Parr, Henry's 6th wife. Catherine survived Henry and remarried after his death. She became pregnant at age 35, relatively old for the time. She gave birth to a daughter in 1548, but died 6 days later from puerperal fever. Her death was noted, but not celebrated. She hadn't produced a male heir. Her daughter, Mary Seymour, disappears from historical records shortly after. Catherine's death was just sad, not heroic, not politically significant. This is the brutal calculus of medieval queenship. Your life mattered less than your child's gender, and even your death could be weaponized as proof of devotion, as a cautionary tale, or as a convenient exit when you were no longer useful. So there you have it. Medieval queens didn't just endure pregnancy and childbirth, they weaponized it. They used pregnancy to negotiate treaties, delay divorces, and secure power. They hid miscarriages to protect their positions. They turned their children into political instruments, and they risked their lives over and over because their bodies were the battlefields on which dynasties were built. We romanticize medieval queens, the crowns, the castles, the power. But the reality was brutal. Your body wasn't yours. Your children weren't yours. Even your death wasn't yours. Everything was political. Everything was strategic, and the smartest queens understood this. They didn't just survive the system, they manipulated it. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Blanche of Castile. These women weren't victims. They were players, and the game they played, using their own bodies as weapons, was one of the most dangerous in history. Because when you lose that game, you don't just lose power, you lose everything.